Hello everybody. Today I'm going to teach you a little bit about the DOM, Document Object Model. Now if you're anything like me, when you first learned about the DOM, you're probably pretty confused. I mean, I was too. Um, I thought it was maybe a way of organizing things or a style of programming or programming language, and not any of that is 100% true. The Document Object Model is an API completely separate from the coding languages that you use, for example, HTML, JavaScript, Python. It's completely independent, and it's used to interpret HTML and XML files. Now, let's take a look at the phrase document object model. I'm going to separate this into three different sections. We're going to look at each one. The first one is document. Now we're going to start with this document, an HTML file. It could be HTML, XML, these basic frames that websites are on. Those files are the ones that the DOM will pick apart. It's going to start with a file, and then it's going to take a look at the object or the objects inside the file. And that's when it picks apart the HTML file and sorts it into tags, elements, and finally we look at model, and it's going to model all those elements in a way that we could access using any other coding language. For example, we have this JavaScript file here, or representation of a JavaScript file, and I want to use this JavaScript to mess with the HTML file, or to adjust it, or to retrieve information from a form, or to put information or text on there depending on the conditions that I put in my JavaScript file. Well, it's got a lot of steps to go through before I can actually get there, and that's what the DOM is for. For example, that JavaScript file is like this wonderful Lego Mario statue. It's all put together, and when you go on a website with this HTML page, it will be all put together. It will sort this into all of its bricks, right? It will take this Mario apart and turn it into every brick is like an object, a tag or an element or a piece of the puzzle that makes it. And it will turn it into completely organized blocks, right? So it goes from here to blocks, and only that way can the JavaScript file access all of those little blocks and mess around with it. Now, the DOM you could visualize in several ways. I like to look at it as like a pyramid with the main large objects or nodes first, like main, body, head, HTML, the big ones that hold everything else. And underneath it, we have like our divs and our sections. And at the very bottom, we have P elements, H1, H2, form, smaller elements that are always inside larger elements of an HTML file. And now each one has its own hierarchy or parentage. And that's why I like this example of a bracket, like a tournament bracket, because each small element here, for example, this is a P and an H1, they're underneath this div or this section or main or body, and then it goes all the way back up to HTML. And so an H1 here is going to have a different parentage or a different hierarchy than an H1 here. But organizing like this allows your JavaScript files or any other language to access exactly the elements you want. Now the comparison I want to make is if any of you have seen the movie Encanto, it's a huge family. And so you've got where's the girl? We got the abuela right there, and she has 3 kids, and each of her kids have kids, well, except Bruno. And so you can see this whole family photo. It's beautiful. It's a great family. But they're all mixed together, right? So what the DOM does is it takes it apart and organizes it in a way we can understand. So look at this family tree. We have the grandma, her 3 kids, and then her grandkids. And so organized like that, we can use this information and mess with it if this were, for example, an HTML file. So now we're going to look at some real examples. Here we have a little HTML file, little code that I wrote. It's nothing big, but as you can see, it's got a main, 2 different sections. In each section, this one has 2 divs, and this one has 2 lists, an ordered and unordered list. And then each inside this, each has 2 items. Wow. But this is a little unusual. Usually there wouldn't be exactly 2 items inside each node or element here, but I'll do this for the family tree. So we're going to do the DOM's job, the document object model, and we're going to organize them by hand so you get an idea of how it works. So I'm going to throw main up at the top. It is the abuela, the grandma, that just holds the whole family together. Everything comes from main, right? So when we look at it, we've got 2 sections right inside main. And it's really easy because you can just look at the indentation and say, oh, that's indented and it's one indent over. It must be a child element of that parent. Boom. Grandma main had 2 kids named to both sections. They're probably twins. The first section has 2 divs, right? So now grandma has a couple grandbabies, both named div. And these 2 we can tell are inside the section elements, opening and closing elements, and that's how we know where to place them on the family tree. Inside the first div, we have an H1 and a P, and the second div is easy. We got 2 P's. So when we organize it like this, that shows us that this is the hierarchy of the elements here. Easy peasy. So the next one, for example, we have an ordered list up here, and an unordered list as the 2 child elements of section, and then each one has 2 list items each. So easy peasy. So if you look at that, we have just done the DOM's job and organized each element on here based on the hierarchy. And now we, if we were physically a JavaScript profile, could reach in and take this H1, boop, pull it out and mess around with it, right, with lines of code. And that's what makes us able to do that, is organizing like this way the DOM. Let's look at some real world examples. This is almost the same code, except I messed with it a little bit to add a form instead of one of the lists so we can mess with the form. Let's look at this line of code up here and see how we can use JavaScript and the DOM to access elements on an HTML file. So this line is in JavaScript, right? It sets the variable paragraphs and it uses the DOM. This right here takes advantage of the DOM, document.getElementsByTagName, and it will return an array of all of the items that are by that tag name. So if we look at the code, we have a P here, a P here, and a P here. It will grab both of the, or all 3 of those. And so if you take the first item on that list, it will give you the first P item in that HTML file, and second, and third, and so on. And so now you can use that to either retrieve or modify the P elements from this file. And now document I use as a variable name for the document. This could be whatever your document's name is after you establish it as a variable. Next, we're going to look at some real world code. This code is really responsive, and it's a closer example to what you'd actually see in a website. We define the variable username, and we use document.getElementById name. So if we look at the document, we look down and we find ID equals name. It's an input field, right? So whatever is inside this input field, it will retrieve and store the value as username. And then it will take document.querySelector H1 will happen to, well, it will get the H1 element here, find the text content, and make that the username. And what that does is it makes a responsive website that if you go to the input field and type Ryan, if your name is Ryan, it will modify this H1 to say Ryan. So it will say Ryan, welcome. And if you change it to Daniel, it will say Daniel, welcome. And so that is an example of responsive code that you could have on your HTML file using the document object model. And the great thing about this is you can use this with any coding language. It's not JavaScript specific, although I, in my experience, have only used the DOM with JavaScript. There are so many applications you can make with so many different languages. And so to summarize, the DOM is a way to unpack HTML files in a way that coding languages and the files of those languages can understand. And that way you can retrieve information from your HTML page or store information or place items on your HTML page. I hope you learned something today. If you have any questions, comment them below. Have a wonderful day.